right, everybody. Thanks for coming out for tonight's History Talk, sponsored by the Champaign County History Museum. My name's Sylvester. I'm the museum manager here. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank you all for coming and let you know that we do have more events that the museum sponsors and brings to our local community members. We have 2 new exhibits that are going to be opening just in a few weeks, so I'd highly recommend you come to the museum before it's too late when we tear those exhibits down and put up our new ones. That being said, let me go ahead and introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Haile. Growing up in Kansas City and St. Louis, Mike was blessed to listen to some awesome radio. His letter writing as a high school student got him into WIL, KSD, KSHE, and KXOK to observe from some of the best. That led to an opportunity in 1969 as a junior high student to be a weekend air personality at WGNU in Granite City for legendary station owner Chuck Norman. He worked 4 years at KWOW in suburban Los Angeles while getting his bachelor's degree at Cal State at Long Beach. Then he spent 3 years traveling the country installing broadcast automation systems for SMC out of Bloomington. After heading back to Los Angeles briefly, Mike took an interesting opportunity in 1978 to be the operations manager for a group based out of Champaign. Part of the deal, the company would teach him sales. His plan was to be in the CU for no more than 2 years and then move on. But 2 years quickly turned into 43. Mike worked for WKIO radio for 22 years before joining WDWS WHMS as assistant general manager and morning show host on WHMS in 2000. And then he became appointed VP general manager in 2006. In 2020, he was named the recipient of the W. Russell Withers Broadcast Pioneer Award. In addition to his management roles, Mike has hosted morning drives for almost 46 years in the CU area. In 2021, he transitioned into somewhat semi-retirement, opting to continue in the morning drive on WHMS and afternoons on WKIO, as well as continuing as a member of the board of directors of the Champaign Multimedia Group, owners of the WDWS, WHMS, WKIO, and the News Gazette. Among his broadcast industry boards this century, the Illinois Broadcasters Association for 2 terms, as well as the Arbitron-Nielsen Ratings Broadcast Advisory Council, representing broadcasters in 117 markets around the country. And today, Mike will be speaking about local radio in the area. And now let's thank Mike Haile.
Okay, I'm thrilled you came out tonight. Thanks for, wow, I'm thrilled to do this. I've loved radio since I was 5 years old. And I mean, when I was 5 years old, that's when I decided that I wanted to do radio. About the time I got to be 10 and got to visit more radio stations, my mind started to think, okay, individuals in a radio studio playing records 4 hours a day. And then they're going home. I said, this is great. I like music. I can talk and then go home. It sounds like a career to me. Anyway, what I have is a copy of kind of the timeline I'm going to walk us through tonight. And everybody can have their own.
Oh, boy.
Okay. It's kind of a timeline. This has really been fascinating for me when they asked me to do this. Being able to explore and ask a lot of people questions about what it was like before I got to Champaign in '78. So what I've done is broken this up into a timeline from 1922 to 1978, and then we'll talk about that, and then we'll go frequency by frequency on the radio dial and what the history of those stations have been since I came here. So there are, if you want to read some great resources for radio and radio history, I've listed them on here. The worldradiohistory.com is put together by a guy named David Gleason. And I don't know what his motivation is, because there's no advertising, there's no pop-ups, I don't know if he got a great inheritance when he retired or what, but he has gathered all of the broadcast industry publications dating back to the 20s. People have donated stuff to him, and he has put it on this massive website. It is phenomenal. So that's a place, if you want to go look, for example, at Broadcasting Magazine, and you want to just see, okay, what stories were written about WDWS in the 40s? You just put WDWS in. It'll spit out a whole bunch of information. That's the first thing. Anybody have newspapers.com? I gotta tell you, that is one of my favorite websites. It costs $60 every 6 months, I think, or something like that. It is well worth it. The Champaign papers aren't well represented yet, but hopefully they will. All the surrounding papers are in there. The DI is in there. Also, how many of you know Doug Quick? Yeah, Doug Quick has done an amazing job gathering information about television stations and his favorite radio stations. His book is phenomenal, and as I told Will, he's got to come and speak to you guys somewhere along the way because he's a phenomenal guy. So I've got his website on there. Now, interrupt me at any point, ask any question. We're just kind of waltz through this here. And afterwards, you can think about something and think, hey, more about this, or hey, I think you were wrong about this, but I didn't want to embarrass you in front of everybody. I got my email address on there. And one of the things that I am working on, thanks to the push from some longtime employees, we're going to put a Facebook page together, group, that will have some of the stuff from radio from '78 when I came here forward. I like to think I was pretty savvy in some of the things I did, but I'm very, I kept pretty good records of what the competitive landscape was, and I have little notebooks from every year of what we did and what our competitors did. And so I've been persuaded to maybe post some of that stuff. So if you'll send me, send me something in an email, I'll hold on to it, and when we put it together, I will reach out to you and tell you, hey, it's up. Okay, so let's go to 1921. Even though it wasn't in Champaign County, WDZ in Tuscola originally was really the first radio station in the state of Illinois and the first radio station in this area. But primarily, what they did was farm reports, commodities, so on. So they would be on the air for 25 or 30 minutes, then they'd be off the air and then come back on the air again. So it was the Wild Wild West of radio when it first got started. Because really, this is the second year. The first station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, went on the air late in 1920. But locally in Champaign County, on April 6, WRM took to the air at the University of Illinois. WRM standing for We Reach Millions. Now, I'm not sure they ever got to those million listeners, but one of the cool things about radio in that time was the fact that even if you only had 50 watts, and that's what they started with, 50 watts, it would go a long ways because there wasn't any interference. There were very few radio stations on the air at the time. And the best I can tell, and there was a terrific guy, Rob Belden, who was the chief engineer of WILL in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and halfway through the 80s. And I had a lot of conversations with him after he retired. But he kind of told me for about a 4 or 5 year period, WRM would be at different places on the dial, because it truly was the Wild Wild West. They would be on one frequency, and then maybe somebody else would be on that same frequency in New Orleans, and they would interfere with each other. So it just floated around the dial. Now, if you look at the DI back in those days, you'll find some pretty interesting. I mean, they talked about the radio station almost every day. You would find out what professors were going to be sharing their thoughts on political topics, on scientific projects, and so on. And so WRM lasted until 1928, and that's when the Federal Radio, and that's my first typo on this, it should be the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission. The government decided that we got to put something in place here, because it truly was the Wild West. People were putting unlicensed radio stations on the air. If you're from St. Louis, Stixbury and Fuller, big department store in St. Louis, they had their own radio station, but it was unlicensed. They just put the radio station on there so they could tell everybody about what they had at the store. And they'd have somebody sing for a little while and then come back. But so at that point, WRM was able to acquire the call letters they wanted initially, which was WILL. There was a rogue radio station somewhere that was using those call letters. So they got WILL, and they were assigned 890. Now 890 on the dial is what? Today, WLS. But they were on 890, and they shared time with a land-grant university station in Iowa and one in South Dakota. So they would be on the air for maybe 4 or 5 hours, and then Iowa would be on the radio for 3 or 4 hours in South Dakota, and then I'd come back in the evening time and WILL would be on. So that's the way WILL operated for the first few years. We're still at this point in time, we don't even have a commercial radio station in Champaign. Every other town, Decatur, Bloomington, Danville, all had commercial radio stations, but not in Champaign. In 1929, the first radio superstar in Champaign County was hired. Now, how many of you have heard of the name of Frank Schooley? Yeah. Frank was the first full-time employee at WILL, and this guy did everything. This guy set up remotes, this guy broadcast football games, this guy broadcast in the morning. He was incredible, and he did that for 43 years. So I call him the first real superstar of Champaign radio. Phenomenal guy. Okay, by 1935, WILL, as a shared time station, raised their power from their initial 50 to 100 watts in 1922 to 1,000 watts during the daytime, 250 watts at night. Significant because at 1,000 watts, they really, where they were located, where the tower was located at that time on campus, it really got out. They had a terrific signal. But they filed a construction permit, CP, a construction permit, to change frequencies to 580. And to be at 1,000 watts, but be daytime only, and not have to share their frequency with anybody else. So they could really have regular programming on the air. At the same time, D.W. Stevik, who was the owner of the News Gazette, filed a construction permit to build WDWS at 1370 and be a daytime radio station at just 100 watts. It took to the air in 1937, so WILL seized the opportunity in 1939 to raise their power to the limit on that frequency, which is 5,000 watts. And at 5,000 watts, they have a hell of a signal during the daytime. They have a city-grade signal in Chicago during the daytime, and they really have, they're on a terrific frequency, which is on the low end of the radio dial. DWS, in the meantime, was granted full-time status, so it became full-time, not 24 hours a day, but they would sign on at 6:30 in the morning, and they would sign off at 10 o'clock at night, unless there was a ball game. So they'd stay on a little later if there was a ball game. In 1941, the Federal Radio Commission had morphed into being the Federal Communications Commission. And they needed to bring a real sense of organization to the AM dial. The AM dial, even though stations were licensed, it was kind of slipshod here and there, and they were allowing applications. So the Federal Communications Commission spent about 4 years studying every radio station that was on the air and figuring out what needed to be done so stations did not interfere with each other. So at 3 a.m. on March 29th, 1941, it was the great frequency shift. So all of a sudden, when WDWS signed off on the 28th, they were at 1370. But when you got up the next morning, they were on 1400. And this happened to hundreds of radio stations across the country. WLS, 890, that's how they got to 890. WLS and WENR, that's how they got there. So WILL, though, remained, because it was a land-grant university, and it had what they called land-grant license privileges, they did not have to change frequencies. Also in 1941, the University of Illinois became the first university to put an FM radio station on the air. And it was WUIC at 42.9 megahertz. And what's interesting about this is the University of Illinois spent the rest of the 40s experimenting with FM. The Federal Communications Commission really didn't care what was going on in FM. They would license you, but they licensed like 4 different frequencies during that time, and they were trying to understand if it was going to, and it was an academic pursuit, if FM radio was going to be a viable platform to broadcast on. And I would love, and Rob Belden told me some of the stories, but they tried everything. And they would go to people's houses and beg them to take an FM receiver that they had built at the University of Illinois, that begged them to take a receiver and listen to WILL on this crystal clear FM. And some people said, sure. Others said, well, no, I've got my radio here. Gets WILL just fine. But it was quite an interesting undertaking by the university. And I frankly don't think FM would have expanded as fast as it did if it wasn't for what was done at the University of Illinois. In 1946, and this is the closest date I can come to this, and Larry Stewart became a popular radio personality at WDWS. He was the nighttime disc jockey who broadcast from the Illini Union playing jazz. And he was a very colorful, outspoken, wouldn't I be correct in saying outspoken individual? Yeah, but anyway, if we were to look at the first big disc jockey in Champaign, it would be Larry Stewart.
That's who we listened to during breakfast when I was growing up.
Really?
Yeah. So the late 50s, early 60s, it was Larry Stewart with breakfast before we went to school.
There you go. There you go. Because there was no rock and roll in
No.
Champaign at that time. In 1947, DWS elevated, and I've tried to find out when Mark Howard came to work for WDWS, but they elevated him to a management position at this point. And he was the father, the early father of a show that morphed into being A Penny for Your Thoughts. And this is long before they took telephone calls, but you would call in and ask whatever question or give whatever complaint, and then he would in turn announce that on the air. And then somebody else would call and say, well, I got an answer to that. At that point in time, listeners calling in were not being aired on the radio. That still took 5 or 6 more years for that to happen. But in 1948, WKID AM went on the air at 1580. It was a daytime only station at 250 watts. And they also put an FM station on the air at 103.3. And that station did a little bit of everything, as best I can tell. Because neither one of the newspapers, neither the Courier nor the News Gazette, I can tell you the News Gazette was not interested in talking about WKID whatsoever. I was very fortunate to work for a couple of years before Mrs. Kinnigo passed away. So I got a pretty good idea of the attitude that prevailed within the hallways of the News Gazette promoting other radio stations. In November of 48, WDWS FM went on the air, and at that point in time, it was the most powerful FM station in East Central Illinois. Decatur was on the air, Bloomington was on the air, but at 27,000 watts, it was the most powerful. And it started simulcasting WDWS AM to begin with, and that's when they built the tower down on Route 45. The tower had been on top of what used to be the old News Gazette building, and it was called a long wire tower, in which there were 2 towers, and then there was a long wire that went between the 2 towers. And I'm a FCC first class licensed engineer, and I still don't understand how those things work. There's still 2 stations in the United States that broadcast AM that way. But anyway, they moved down to this great new tower, and the tower that was built was pretty phenomenal. As deep as they went down, the footings on that tower go down about 47 feet. I mean, and that's a lot of concrete, And it was a Truscon steel tower, so it's a solid iron core tower. Pretty phenomenal structure. Anyway, 1949, WUIC settles on 89.9 with 20,000 watts before they move again here shortly. 1952, Larry Stewart began as a top management role at WDWS. In 1954, WKID AM was sold, and they turned the license for the FM station in. And that was a pretty common occurrence in the 50s, because nobody was listening to FM radio. They were trying so many different things for FM radio back in the 50s. In major cities, FM stations worked deals with bus companies to play their radio station that was coming out on FM in their buses, and that failed. There was no real inspiration to get FM going, because 99 and 44, 100% of listening was on AM radio. And in 1955, Rob Belden became the chief engineer at WILL, and now they moved to 90.9, and they blasted 300,000 watts out of their tower, which they built a new tower over near Monticello. And when I was a kid in St. Louis, you could hear WILL FM, once again, because the radio was, there were just not that many stations on the air. You could hear them in St. Louis. And because I thought it was an unusual sounding radio station, because it sounded like the people on the radio were not happy to be there. Well, now you gotta remember, I'm a 10-year-old here, and I'm hearing guys go, "You're listening to WILL from the campus of the University of Haile." Okay, what kind of radio is this? But anyway, and a guy named Joe Ryder became the sales manager at WKID. And Joe Ryder had a great career in Champaign at WKID to begin with, and then he moved over to WDWS, and he did a country music show in the morning when they signed on at 5 o'clock from 5 until 6:30. And the guy sold his own advertising, and the guy was phenomenal. He did that show until they took him off in 1982. And he was one of the first disc jockeys who went out and embraced sales and sold time on his own show. He was a phenomenal guy. 1963, Frank Stewart puts WLRW FM on the air at 94.5. And they started out at the original site, which is across from Parkland College. And many of you know Vicki Stewart, who lived in Champaign. That was her dad. And that house that the station broadcast from had a pool in the basement for Vicki, because Vicki had a handicap that she really needed to be using a pool for exercise. So her dad built her a swimming pool in the basement. But that radio station has been at the same place, and the reason is it's on one of the highest plots of ground in Champaign and Urbana. And in FM, you want to be as high as possible, because FM is more line of sight. And so he took it on, he put it on the air. And at this point in time, and I'm not sure, I don't know the whole story about it, and that's one of the things that I'm going to try to do a little more research on. At that time, WDWS FM had an agreement to supply beautiful music into the IGA stores. So that's what they were running at the time, beautiful music, and they would play it in all the IGA stores. So Frank Stewart worked out a deal with Eisner's to play his radio station in the Eisner's and get paid for it. So Frank Stewart had a pretty good game plan when he put the radio station on the air and made money from the get-go. And there were very few people doing FM radio that were making money. Also in 1963, WRTL AM signed on in Rantoul, owned by Bob Brown. Bob Brown had been a salesperson at DWS for a number of years, but he and his partner put WRTL AM on in Rantoul. And at that time, Rantoul was a pretty thriving community. And this was another case where they built a radio station and Rantoul embraced it and supported it big time. 1967, WPGU FM goes on the air at Weston Hall. Now, WPGU's origins began back in the early 50s as what they call a carrier current radio station, where it broadcast to all the buildings at the University of Illinois via the electricity. And the carrier current was you plugged your radio into the outlet, and the original WPGU signal went through the electrical current and went into your radio, and you went to, in this case here, I think they were at 6:40 a.m., I think. But that's how you heard the station. If you had transistor radio, you could not hear WPGU before 1967. But anyway, they signed on at Weston Hall, owned by the Daily Illini, obviously an independent operation from the university, because the rules at that time were that the university could not have owned that radio station. But because the Daily Illini and that company that ran the Daily Illini was separate, they could have the radio station. And they quickly became all things pop and rock and soul. And one of the first student managers was the late attorney at law, Bob Aller. And Bob would tell me until just before he died, there are so many days I wish I would have stayed in radio and not been a lawyer. And those of you who have lived here for a long period of time know Bob Aller has been involved with a lot of high-profile cases in our community. But Bob Aller was one of the first managers. And on December 4th, an electrician who lived in Mahomet put a radio station on at 505 South Locust, which was WTWC, which stood for Where the World Communicates. And they had an easy listening music format, and that would morph into another station that we'll talk about in a moment. In 1969, Frank Stewart acquired WKID AM and renamed it WCCR, Country Club Radio, and it became country music station. The first country music station in town, WIAI in Danville, was the only country music station you could hear, and that was on FM at 99.1. Also in 1969, WILL broadcast from a new tower, higher up but less power, and this was in conjunction with Channel 12 getting a bigger signal in the area. So they were on the same tower as Channel 12, and they dropped power to 105,000 watts, which frankly didn't affect its coverage whatsoever. 1971, Dick Glover, a local businessman, acquired WLRW and WCCR from Frank Stewart. And this is where FM radio started getting competitive. WLRW began contemporary music programming with an automated format that was called Hit Parade, and then it shifted over to Solid Gold, and then the format was XT40. But basically, it was a top 40 station with a live morning show with a lady named Jody Anderson, and an overnight live show, and then featured programming on the weekend highlighted by Ernie Westfield, who was a former Negro League baseball player who worked for the state of Illinois at that time. And I forget where he worked at the state of Illinois, but he did this Sunday night show on WLRW that was pretty popular until, I think, when did he quit the show? 1980 or 81. But yeah, this, at long last, there was competition to WLS at this time, because if you wanted to listen to rock in Champaign, our top 40, you had WLS, you had WPGU. During the daytime, you could hear WITY in Danville. And earlier on, back in the late 50s, you could hear WPEO in Peoria. But there just was really no rock programming whatsoever in the marketplace until PGU and LRW came on. And also in 72, WRTL added an FM station with an easy listening format. And later in 72, WTWC, which was making no money, according to Bob Durst, dropped easy listening, and he went after WPGU's audience in doing progressive rock, folk, and free-form programming. Basically, people would graduate from the U of I, graduate from PGU, and come to work over at WTWC. That lasted for about 3 years, and then they were making no money doing that. So he decided to put easy listening back on and said, okay, let's do a country music show in the morning and compete with Joe Lobble, and compete with Joe Ryder, with a guy named Joe Lobble, who was a painter at the U of I. So he would sign the station on at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would be on from 5 until 7, and then he would change clothes in the back of the radio station and get his work attire on, and he'd be over on the job at 7:30 on Oak Street as a painter at the U of I. 1978, WPCD came on the air at Parkland College. If you've lived here for any length of time, you know the name Ed Kelly. Ed Kelly was on Channel 3 for a long time, and Ed was the faculty advisor for WPCD. Also that year, local attorneys Bill Gaston and Bill Goldstein. Bill Gaston, who was assistant state's attorney for about 20 years, who needs to write a book. He's a longtime friend. I've tried to convince him to write a book about what it was like to be the assistant state's attorney in Champaign County in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but he says he's taking all of that to his grave, which is too bad. It's too bad. But anyway, the two Bills bought WLRW from Dick Glover, because Dick Glover wanted to take that money from the sale of WLRW and buy 2 radio stations in Raleigh, North Carolina, which he did, and he became very successful at it. And on May 8th, Rantoul businessman Ernie Halls, big insurance guy, and broadcast executive Bill Ehrman, who I had worked with at the automation company in Bloomington a handful of years earlier, purchased WTWC for $235,000. And that's how I got enticed to come. I swore when I left Bloomington to go back to California and work at KFI, I swore I was not going to move back to the Midwest. But the opportunity, because I wanted to learn sales, so the opportunity to learn sales, I just thought this would be a great place to come. And I remember my first trip to Champaign. I digress here. 1974. And so I went to Peoria one weekend after I moved to Bloomington. And I said, I think I'm going to go to Champaign on Saturday. He said, okay, they got a real good shopping center there. This is before Marketplace, called Lincoln Square. I said, so how do you get to it? Okay, so he told me how to get to it. So I drive to Champaign, I get off at Cunningham, I go down, I pull into Lincoln Square, and I said, this can't be Lincoln Square. Who in their right mind has parking meters in a shopping center? You mean let me get this straight. I'm coming to your shopping center, I gotta feed the meter, I gotta pay to park, to go shop? This is not downtown Chicago. I'm like, what is this? So that was my first exposure to Champaign. And, but then we used to come down to Champaign, as many did, to go to the Red Lion and other things when I was in town on the weekend. So that Champaign was our preferred place to come and have a good time. So, but anyway, so I moved to Champaign, and that's where the history story ends. And then we'll just go radio station by radio station here, and I just kind of share some of the things that have happened at those radio stations through the years. So we'll go through every frequency in Champaign, and I've written a little something about each one of them. We'll start at 5:80 a.m. WILL. They used to have a lot of classical music on WILL during the middays and afternoon. They got rid of all that down through the years, moved it to the FM, focusing on news talk, especially when NPR began All Things Considered, and then Morning Edition. And then one of the stars of the station was Ed Keyser. He was the weather guy for many years. And they did a lot of ag weather. They frankly did a lot of ag programming because the signal that they had really lent itself. And they got a lot of underwriting from ADM and others for their ag programming. But Ed Keyser was one of the big stars of WILL-AM. They added nighttime signal with 100 watts back sometime in the mid-90s. And it's got a nice little signal on AM at night in Champaign. And then of course they became a founding member of a statewide public radio consortium that has really put together some great statewide news initiatives. You know, they anchor debates these days, and so they continue to have a very robust identity. So let's go down the dial to 1400. Lauren Tate and Larry Stewart began Saturday Sports Line in 1979, and this thing was 2 hours. 2 hours of interviews, and there was really nothing like, very little of this type of programming on the radio, very many places. Chicago would have a couple of hours. I mean, this is about 6-7 years before all sports radio exploded. But this was a hot radio show, and as somebody who very research focused, there have been 67 rating books in Champaign between the time I got here and the time that the last rating book was done. And I mean, there were times that Saturday Sports Line would have a 60 share. I mean, everybody was listening to it, and it was a very hot program. So Larry Stewart retires, and Jim Turpin comes in and succeeds Larry Stewart as the general manager, the host of Penny for Your Thoughts, and play-by-play. And frankly, when you look at a show like Penny for Your Thoughts, it's really phenomenal that you go back to its earliest form that Mark Howard had. It's had 4 hosts down through the years. I mean, that's unbelievable. You have Mark Howard, you got Larry Stewart, you got Jim Turpin, and then I'm the guy that made the decision. I was the hated person who made the decision to put Brian on. All right? Goes with the territory. But I think everybody will agree Brian has done an unbelievable job on the show. And I will say, this is the only thing I'll say about my time in management. My biggest disappointment was that Jim Turpin did not accept my offer to do a morning segment that he could do anything he wanted to. Charles Osgood was getting ready to retire, and it was my desire to have Jim still have a office in the building and to be able to do a commentary at 8:25 every morning. You could do it live, you could pre-record it, you could do it on the phone. And I said, anything we sell on that, in addition to what I'll pay you, we'll split it 50-50. And he didn't accept that offer. And I tried because I wanted him to still be a participant. And that's one of my, that is probably my single biggest disappointment of all my years of being management, both at KIO and at DWS, that he didn't accept that. But anyway, back to Stevie J joins the station in 1984 to do an afternoon talk show. And frankly, the idea that Jim Turpin had, he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a telephone line. You can call anybody, anywhere during those 3 hours. We just want to do something that's different. You had Penny at that time was running from 10 until noon. Jim Manley was on in the morning till 10. Penny ran 10 to noon, and then he had a news hour in the 12 o'clock hour, and then Stevie was on from 1 until 4. And he'd call telephone booths around the world. He would do all sorts of crazy stuff. And it was really terrific programming in the marketplace. In 1987, Mike Kelly began doing Illini volleyball play-by-play. WDWS became the second radio station in the country to undertake radio volleyball play-by-play. WKMI in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Western Michigan, was the first station to do it. And Mike Kelly, I mean, there wasn't anybody to go, ooh, let me study this person. I mean, Mike did a phenomenal job, and Dave Lone succeeded Mike when Mike went to Campbell X in St. Louis. And then Mike has been the play-by-play guy for University of Missouri football and basketball since the mid-90s. But this was pretty phenomenal radio programming. And the volleyball, foundation of the volleyball success in Champaign can be traced back to the amount of radio time that was devoted in the early years, in the Mike Hebert years, and nobody else in the country was doing this kind of stuff. In 1990, Stevie J succeeded longtime personality, morning personality, Jim Manley. Jim had been doing the show since 1973. Jim is still retired, living up in Fisher, and it's the, what is it? The Manley something, what does he call it? The Manley Estate, whatever. But he's got a fishing pond up there, and he migrates down a couple of times a year to come and see us. But a great longtime member of the DWS family. In '96, Jim Turpin retired as general manager, but continued to do penny and play-by-play. Stevie J was named the manager in 1997, and Stevie's first act divided the radio station. It was single-handedly one of the best things that he did. Rush Limbaugh was playing on WLS. I was a competitor across the street at WKIO. I love the fact that DWS did not have Rush Limbaugh on. But, they looked at the numbers. In middays, it was Wixie, Oldies 92, and WLS. And at that point, WDWS was 7th or 8th in middays. And the day I heard that they were going to put Rush Limbaugh, I go, are you kidding me? Really? Because that ate into Wixie, it ate into us. Because Rush Limbaugh was almost at his peak at that point in terms of radio ratings. It would stay high until he died. But and I gotta tell you, in the building, I heard the stories. The sales department said, you can put it on the air, but we're not gonna sell it. Wait a minute. You're gonna have the #1 talk show and you're not gonna sell it. So anyway, but that was, And that ushered in a lot of changes that Stevie made that were for the betterment of WDWS, and frankly took WDWS from the 70s well into the 90s. In 2000, Brian Barnhart came to DWS. He came here originally just to wait out to see if he could get another Major League Baseball play-by-play job. Yeah, we were going to make sure that wasn't going to happen. And Steve Kelly came over, and Dave Shaw, who had been escorted out of Channel 3, basically. I mean, he retired when the new owners took over. And so he came over, joined us. In 2006, Stevie J stepped out as general manager, retained his morning show. In 2010, Stevie and the Atkins bought several radio stations, and that's when I got to tell Stevie that you can't continue to do the morning show here. You're owning other stations. But Stevie J, I tell people this all the time, the best telephone call I got in my entire career was the day Stevie J called me when it was announced that WKIO, the station I had been at for 22 years, had been sold. And it takes 4 months from the time that, in those days, when you announced the sale before, he said, I know you're not gonna be looking for another job, but would you be willing to talk? And so he and John Foreman sat down, and I was very intrigued by what they proposed. And so I went to work at DWS. But Dave Gentry took over as the morning show. Brian Barnhart became the host of Penny. The stations were acquired along with the newspaper in 2019 by the Champaign Multimedia Group, which was a company based out of West Frankfort, Illinois. This is a group that had 43 newspapers all making money. And they had been great stewards of our stations and the newspaper since they acquired it. They're a terrific company. And Grant Thompson, who I gave him his first radio job, became general manager when I stepped down in 2022. Okay, 1460 AM. That was WRTL. It sold to Indianapolis owners in 1984. Then it was sold again in 1988. Then it became a talk station. In fact, that's where Rush Limbaugh was at first, was on 1460, but they didn't promote it, so nobody knew it was on there. Earlier this century, 1460 became the market's first Hispanic formatted radio station owned by a group out of Chicago. 1580, they had been country. They dropped country in 1992 for a format called Music of Your Life, and it was big bands. It was classic singers and big bands from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. That lasted for a couple of years, and they went with a pure oldies format called WJTX, where the rock still rolls. The station was purchased in 1990 by Vernon Barkstall, Lonnie Clark, J.W. Pirtle, and they installed an urban format at that time. And I've been friends with Lonnie Clark. Lonnie Clark used to hang around with a guy named Tony Clements and I. And Lonnie calls me one day and says, J.W. and Vern and I have bought a radio station. I said, what? He said, Busey Bank gave us an opportunity to buy this radio station, and we're gonna, and they turned it into a very successful urban radio station aimed to the black market in the community. And Sadly, when the last of the founders passed away, J.W. Pearl, the station went away. And that's a sad point in time because there were some things afoot to try to preserve the radio station. And it wasn't to be, sadly. So that's it for AM. So we'll go through FM pretty
I
quickly.
have a question.
Yes.
When a station like that goes silence, what does the FCC do with the frequency? I mean, does it go back in the pot and somebody else can pick it
No,
up?
they are not licensing any new AM stations. Anytime you turn in your license since 2012, 2011, when you take a station off the air, they let you do what's called an STA, which is a temporary authority to sign off for up to a year. You can do an STA, and things have happened where they've had serious technical issues, they've had flooding places, what have you. But the FCC is no longer licensing any new AM stations. So when it went silent, that was it. All right, we go to FM. So 88.7 WPCD has been an awesome training ground. I hired dozens of people from PCD down through the years. And Ed Kelly was their first advisor, a guy named Steve Brown, Dan Hughes, Jerry Brock, and Tom McDonald. I mean, there are hundreds of broadcasters across the country that owe their career to these guys and the training they got at Parkland, because there were very few junior colleges that had a robust radio station, number one, and had and basically let the students program the radio station within parameters. And it was just an awesome opportunity.
I'm a student in 143 right now at Parkland.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
So you're doing a show?
Yeah, I have a show.
When are you on?
I'm on Tuesday morning,
What time?
7 a.m. to 9 a.m.
Okay.
Yeah.
When do you play?
Well, we play alternative rock.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Is that in your wheelhouse?
Yeah, I can play alternative rock
Okay.
for sure.
You can play anything.
I go a long way back.
You can play
go
anything.
through a lot of stuff.
It's just a different set of music.
Yeah, I'm having a blast. I'm having such a great time.
Great.
And it's really hands-on, and you get into 141 first, and you're involved immediately. I mean, within the first couple of weeks, you're pretty much on the air. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't take long to get you on the air.
Yeah.
And then you just get more comfortable.
Who's alternative rock? What kind of music is that?
You've heard of Nirvana? I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of the most iconic alternative rock band there was.
Okay.
So, but that was a long time ago. It still continues on. There's I mean,
Yeah, well, it fills
grunge rock.
yeah, it fills a niche in the marketplace. And that's frankly
College
what's
radio.
happened to music radio is it's all fallen into niches. And, you know, there's no longer mass appeal music radio stations on the dial anymore. So anyway, I'm glad to. So what's your goal here? What's your end game?
I just have always been interested in broadcasting. I don't really have an end game. I mean, I'm having a lot of fun with it right now. So
Good.
I'm a middle-aged student, so I'm not a young student. So I'm starting over. So
Cool.
and I've always wanted to get in broadcasting. And I'm just interested in it. So I'm having fun with it.
Great. All right, 89.3 is WGNJ. That's Good News Radio. This is a sister to WGNN, which we'll share with you in a few minutes. This is the Good News network of stations that's run by a guy named Mark Burns. And this is a guy who, this was his vision, this was his mission, this was his calling. And he rolled up his sleeves and got these two radio stations on the air. He got handed a group of radio stations based out of Springfield a handful of years ago, and he's turned it into, I mean, it is a pretty amazing operation. and their programming, they have the 89.3 is more music, and 102.5 is more teaching. But it's pretty remarkable. And a friend of mine, Dave Harriet, who his family owned Harriet's Party Rentals for decades, was the chairman of the board of this nonprofit company for close to 20 years until he passed away. But this is remarkable local radio that has made an impact in the marketplace. 90.1, October 1980, WEFT took to the air. It originally was going to be called WERV. I don't know where the ERV came from, but that's what they applied for and couldn't get it, so they got WEFT. It's another amazing radio station that was started by a group of people that wanted to have an opportunity to do all types of music, to do all types of programming. And they have a great foundation, and they have probably one of the most successful eclectic radio stations in the country. And they have a great support base of listeners who are great contributors. And they've been a real benefit of being able to stream. So now when people move away, and if they fell in love with a show that Lynn White does or what have you, they can take it with them. And so 90.9 WILL FM, nationally recognized classical music station, always found room for other types of small niche programming, whether it be folk or jazz or what have you. Roger Cooper, I call him the superstar of the station. The guy had the most extraordinary voice. He did mornings for 20 years, probably so. Yeah, he really a nice guy, superstar. But some of WILL AM's talk programming is also heard on FM simply because that's where people have gravitated. So all things considered, Morning Edition, they've cut back on some of the music programming. They do the BBC programming at night. And part of the reason Morning Edition, I think, was all things considered first and Morning Edition went second, because WILL AM signal to the west doesn't go very far. It goes up into Wisconsin to the north. It goes to Kentucky to the south, straight to the south. It goes into Ohio in the east. But west, it has to protect a station that's licensed in between Topeka and Manhattan, Kansas. And in fact, if you drive down Windsor Road, this is geeky radio stuff. When you drive down Windsor Road, there's a point in time where you see the two towers that WILL has. When you see them only as one, you'll know that you go straight that way, you'll be between Manhattan, Kansas, and the transmitter site of WIBW between Manhattan and Topeka, because WILL has to protect its signal from not interfering with their signal.
So the antennas are directional then?
Yeah, it's a
So
directional.
you can cut off one
Right.
side of it and still,
Right.
oh, wow, interesting.
Yeah. Now WDWS is strictly omnidirectional, so it goes in all directions, but doesn't have as much power. WBGL signed on in 1980 as a station from a company based out of Carlinville. Once again, this was a religious music station, Christian music outlet that focused on families, and they have acquired several signals in the last few years, and their reach is massive. Jonathan, who does the morning show, is a longtime Mike and a Morning fan. He lives only a few blocks away from our studios, so I will see him every once in a while. He calls me up, and he's a terrific radio personality. In fact, they have a great collection of people on WBGO. It's a great radio station. 92.5. That was the frequency WKIO shifted to in 1990, leaving 103.9. And when we made the move over there, how long am I supposed to go? Can I still go a little longer?
You can go a little bit longer.
Okay, I'll go faster. It was an oldie station when I was there, and it was sold in 2000 for a record-setting $7 million. And no other radio station has been sold for that price in the marketplace. They became the chief, and then they went in to be Rewind. Station licensed to Tuscola at 93.5. Eventually made its way up here. Its biggest claim to fame was known as the Web back in the 90s. It was acquired by Atkins Company and Stevie J, and it went sports and talk back in 2010. WLRW was sold to a couple of different broadcasters, and in the mid-'80s, when Top 40 radio had resurged, they kicked butt in the marketplace. There was a 3-year period that they literally owned the market. We started out, we were worst at 103.9 at the original K104. We went from worst to first when we took over, but they kicked everybody's butt in the marketplace for 2.5 to 3 years. And I made some missteps in programming. I'm not sure it would have kept me doing the job. But if I was the manager, I don't think I would have kept me doing the job. I think the reason why I got to keep the job was I was bringing in a lot of income on the morning show. So, anyway, they went to Mix 94.5 back in the early 90s. Been a launching pad for a lot of major personalities. Ian Punnett, who was on WGN for a long time. Melissa Foreman, who's on Light in Chicago. John McKeegan, who is in Iowa. 93.5 has done several different formats. You can kind of go through that. 96.1, same thing. Both those stations acquired by Stevie J. 97.5 was a beautiful music station. Changed to WHMS call letters in 1987, which stands for Helen Marie Stevie, which was Mrs. Kinnigo's mother. So, I'm not sure I should put this on tape, but okay. It was also, they called it Her Majesty's Ship. That's what they called it in the building when I got there. Hey, it's nice to see you. You're on Her Majesty's ship. What are they talking about? All right, let's go to 99.1. Was originally licensed to Danville and was relicensed to Savoy a few years ago. They were country. They went classic rock for a while, and then they went back to country. Wixie 100.3 went on the air in 92 as Garth 100.3. When they went on the air, they did 2 solid weeks of Garth Brooks and created a great buzz in the marketplace. They've withstood every challenge that has come towards them. They really own that franchise. WGNN, we talked about them a little earlier. 103.9, that became WKIO, and you can read the history of that. Let's see, is there anything worth mentioning? No, you can read the history again. I mean, that's the station I was at, so I could have read the 3-page note, but I didn't. And we had some great radio personalities come out of there. Brian Kozad did mornings in New Orleans and San Antonio for a bunch of years, in Springfield and in Wichita. Diane Matt, who is one of my favorites, she worked for me during college, and then she went to San Francisco and got a terrific job in San Francisco, moved down to Los Angeles. She was the first solo morning female personality at a major radio station in Los Angeles. And she also was the announcer on the Arsenio Hall show. And she's now semi-retired in Phoenix, Arizona. Gene Honda did the morning show with me for 5 years before he moved to Chicago. He is the PA announcer for the Chicago White Sox. He's also the voice of the Final Four. He's the PA announcer there. He's also the PA announcer for the Blackhawks. He also does NFL films. He does voices for a lot of things. 104.5 is Radio Free Urbana, run by the Independent Media Center. It's a 100-watt radio station. Once again, kind of like WEFT, giving people an opportunity to do what they want to do. 105.9 was owned by Adlai Stevenson III. He put the station on the air, sold it. It was a rock station to begin with. Went country when Stevie took it over. WPGU, student-run station, expected to make a profit. Programming team has basically changed year after year after year as students come through the program. And then 107.9, licensed to Arcola, is owned by the News Gazette. Okay, I took longer than I was supposed to. Now, here's the thing. If you got any questions, I'll hang around here, but if you just want to email me, please do. And if you want to send me your email address, I'll let you know when we start putting this Facebook thing up and going. So, any questions or anything? Yes?
I want to hear more share.
I want to hear more shit. Okay. So noted. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I appreciate all of you staying just a little bit later than we normally go. That being said, it's wonderful to have Mike here. Many of you know him as our host for our trivia nights. That being said, we're glad to be able to give him the opportunity to talk about his own history and the history of local radio. It's a personal connection for me as well. Before I began in the museum field, I was looking at going into broadcast journalism, both radio and television, and I had worked for 5 years at my local radio station, 97.7 FM and 1330 AM at Prairie Radio Communications in Monmouth, Illinois. That being said, you can't get them here.
You've got the voice for it.
I appreciate that. I get that quite often. But I really appreciate y'all coming out tonight. We do have a reception at the museum on April 13th from 1 to 4 p.m. during the Boneyard Arts Festival, where we'll be celebrating the opening of our 2 new exhibitions that will be replacing our Art in the Museum series and our Robert Zupke exhibition on our 2nd floor. Our next History Talk will be on April 20th, I think. 3rd Thursday of the month, whatever day that is. And we'll be having Bob Sampson, who's a historian from Bloomington, coming and talking about the history of the Eastern Illinois League, or the EI League, here in Champaign County. So once again, thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Good guy,